Welcome everyone to this Royal Historical Society event, Scholarly Editing for Historians. My name is Philip Carter. I'm the Academic Director at the Royal Historical Society, and it's my very great pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's event. Before I hand over to our specialist presenters who will host the remainder of this session, I'm just going to say a few brief words on how today's event will run. We've scheduled 90 minutes for the discussion, and we're going to divide that into two main parts. The first part is going to be for everyone attending, and we're going to look at the basics of identifying, working with, and publishing with scholarly editions. And this first session will last for about 40 to 45 minutes. We're then going to move to two breakout rooms, which cover working with sources for the pre-1800 period and the post-1800 period, where we'll explore in more detail some of the challenges and opportunities open to historians working on different kinds of primary sources and texts over different chronologies. And then for a very brief 5 minutes at the end of the event, we'll all come back together and the presenters will introduce us to the Royal Historical Society's Camden series of texts, of which some of you will be very familiar. So it's my very great pleasure to introduce today's hosts, Dr. Siobhan Talbott and Dr. Richard Gaunt, who since January 2021 have been the series editors for the Royal Historical Society's Camden series of primary printed sources. Richard is Associate Professor of History at the University of Nottingham and a specialist in the history of elections and politics in the late 18th and 19th century. And Siobhan is reader in early modern history at Keele University and a specialist in Atlantic and British transatlantic relations, particularly focusing on society and economics. Most importantly for us today, they are both specialists in the creation and editing of primary sources, and much of their work, academic work to date, has been in working with those sources and more recently working with other editors through the Camden series. So we are with two expert editors who are very knowledgeable about the opportunities afforded by scholarly editing. Richard and Siobhan will host part one, and then in part two, they'll be joined by two recent editors to the Camden series who've published in the series in the last couple of years. Daniel Patterson is the editor of the Diary of George Lloyd, 1642 to 1718, which was published by the Camden series in 2022. And he'll join Siobhan in the pre-1800 breakout room. And then Jayne Gifford is lecturer in modern history at the University of East Anglia, who in 2021 co-edited the Camden volume Sir Earle Page's British War Cabinet Diary, 1941 to 1942. And Jayne will join Richard to host the post-1800 breakout room. So without further ado, I'll hand over now to Richard and Siobhan to take forward the first part of today's event.
Right, thanks everybody, and thanks Philip for those introductions. So Siobhan and I are really keen that this afternoon is as useful to you and as collaborative as possible. So we would encourage you to please use the Padlet for any questions as we speak and say things, and we'll try and respond to those. Bear with us because I'm operating between two screens, so I'll be relying on my co-presenter sometimes to make sure I don't miss anything. And I'm hoping that we will cover most of what you would need this afternoon. Certainly, we're going to try and pitch it from an introductory level. So apologies to those of you who are quite experienced, but we hope that we can draw on everybody's experience and ideas about the importance of scholarly editing and some of the things to be aware of. So in this first section, what we're doing is Siobhan and I have come up with a sort of running order of basic areas that we thought you would all be interested in. So we're going to take it in turn to take a lead on them, and then the other party can come in with any comments or thoughts that they may have to add. So as I say, if anything occurs to you as you go along, please do add questions to the Padlet. So the first area we thought you would be interested in considering is how to actually go about selecting a suitable primary source for a scholarly edition. And we're probably going to be concentrating, I know Siobhan's going to go on and talk about the different formats or media in which you can publish editions of sources or types of sources and source commentaries. But we're going to be talking about the scholarly edition. So what that really means is an edition with an analytical introduction, appendices, and all the necessary scholarly sort of scaffolding to make sense of the source for a readership. So I thought the way to think about this was just to recall that the Camden Society is one of the very many 19th century record societies which were established, and their original mission, I guess, was to recover some of the documents and primary sources of the medieval past. And of course, some of the people who first published in the Camden series and other record society series wouldn't really have needed much rationale for how to select a primary source or what was suitable. They would have considered things like documents of government and administration, the doings and thinkings of politically elite figures of the past, largely male figures of the past, as central to the enterprise of publishing scholarly editions. And so for that reason, you'll see there's a continuous tradition, not just in Camden, but many other records series of the records of central or local government, the thoughts and opinions of opinion formers, the elites and policymakers. But of course, helpfully and positively, the range of what interests us as historians has expanded somewhat since the record series like Camden were first established back in the mid-19th century. And I know as editors of the series, Siobhan and I are both very keen to diversify and widen the range of the types of proposals that prospective authors of these volumes might consider pitching to us. So I just wanted to draw attention to a couple of things, and then I'll pass on to Siobhan to see if she wants to add anything or move on to the next question really. I think the key criteria to keep in mind for you if you're thinking about pitching for a scholarly edition is the perhaps naturally obvious one of whether the material justifies publication in an edition of that nature, or are there other formats or other means that are best used for communicating the results of that material. Could it be that the originality of the edition lies in the perspectives which the source has to offer, or the light which it casts on areas which are of interest to historians? And I think there are different ways in which, and we'll go on to talk about this, you can pitch the scholarly value or importance of an edition to a potential publisher, including Camden. Now, of course, the range of material that is encompassed by this term scholarly edition is quite wide-ranging. Diaries necessarily are very popular, but also a series of correspondence, letters, letter books, reports, memoirs, dispatches. That's only just the sort of headlines. There are a whole range of different types of material which are of interest to record societies. Now, to some extent, you might want to start thinking about the sort of boundaries of a scholarly edition, and those boundaries might be sort of imposed or suggested by the nature of the source itself. So a diary or a letter book has, if you like, natural boundaries to it. It has a sort of natural start and end point. But you might also want to think about whether there's a sort of justification for bringing together material from different types of sources or different types or locations of archives and bringing them together, sort of uniting them within a scholarly edition. So just to give you an example from a few years ago from the Camden series, a few years ago, there was a volume here. I don't know if you'll pick up the whole of the title there, but it's Documents on Conservative Foreign Policy, 1852 to 1878. And what that did was bring together around that common theme or common topic material, relevant material from a number of different collections. So you needn't just think in terms of it having to be one specific manuscript from one specific archive. I think Camden, along with other record series, are quite encompassing in terms of what they'll consider. Just to give you two further examples before I move over to Siobhan of what we've recently been publishing in the series. One last year was the political papers of the 7th Marquis of Londonderry. So you might think of that as a sort of fairly traditional Camden fare, a high profile political figure, still really important, and we don't want to discourage people who are interested in these political figures and opinion formers. And what was novel and original about that was bringing together a range of different types of Londonderry's papers, but organising them thematically within the edition. So it was a common source, but it was actually cut up, if you like, or dissected into different themes within the edition. and they did that quite successfully. And then, without preempting our guest speaker too much, but obviously the Diary of George Lloyd, a really important, interesting new type of source coming from someone quite different. The back cover says it's not a record of notable events, but a uniquely quotidian text consisting of regular daily entries. And again, that sort of material is really important. It's not just that record series and scholarly editions are just to replicate the perspectives of the privileged or the elite or the powerful. So hopefully that just gives you a few ways in. Just by way of thinking a little bit more about how should I select my source. Clearly, all record societies are interested in things that are new or original, material which is not previously known to publication. That is obviously fresh material, that's interesting material, so it might be a sort of new source or a new idea that you're trying to put forward through a scholarly edition. But it could be that there's a familiar source, something that historians have known about for quite a long time and have cited in the original manuscript, but there isn't a satisfactory scholarly edition available. Or it's been so familiar, but no one's ever come along and actually put it into a scholarly edition. So again, don't be discouraged by thinking, oh, everybody knows about this source. If it hasn't been done to professional, academic, scholarly standards previously, then chances are there's a good rationale for considering engaging on doing a scholarly edition of that particular issue. I just end on this particular question by again stressing that we as Camden editors certainly are really interested in looking at new types of material which represent different and underrepresented voices, the sorts of perspectives which haven't traditionally been perhaps reflected in scholarly editions or in scholarship more generally. So again, we're not discouraging people from putting in, you know, manuscripts and documents on familiar figures or familiar ideas, but we certainly would strongly encourage anyone who's got new or underrepresented areas that they'd like to bring forward through the mechanism of a scholarly edition. I think I'll leave it at that, and I'll pass over to Siobhan if she's got anything to add or wants to press on to the next point that we've identified for you.
Thanks very much, Richard, and welcome from me as well to everybody that's here. It's lovely to see sort of so many people interested in this method of publishing, which I think can sometimes be a little bit overlooked, or I think sometimes scholars don't necessarily know how to pursue this kind of publication, which is obviously one of the reasons that we wanted to run this workshop. So it's great to see so much interest. And just to again repeat what Richard said about the Padlet. The link to that is at the top of the chat, so you can scroll back up to get to that if you haven't managed to access it. Please do enter any questions that you have. We're very happy to kind of pause what we plan to say to do it in a fairly informal way. But also, as Richard said, we're aware that there will be people here with varying degrees of experience in publishing scholarly editions. So if you have more experience of doing this and you want to query what we've said, or you want to offer your own experience to the room, then please do also type that into the Padlet, and we're very happy to speak to that as well. In terms of what Richard has just said in terms of how to select a suitable primary source, I don't really have anything to add to what he said, all of which I entirely endorse. I think that there is an element of luck involved in finding manuscripts that are suitable for this type of publication. And certainly my own experience of publishing editions has not been that I've thought to myself, I want to publish an edition of this, and I've gone out to look for it. It's been that I've found a manuscript, or I've worked with a manuscript that I've then thought, oh, actually, this is quite important, and this would be a viable scholarly edition. So it may be that there's a source that you've used for a PhD thesis. It may be that it's a source that that you're working on now as part of a project. It might be a source that you've seen and that you've used, but you've not used necessarily extensively. And actually, it might be the type of source that you think, you know, this isn't something that necessarily I want to work on from a research perspective, but it is something that I have the skills to produce as a scholarly edition that other readers might want to make use of. So I guess kind of doing all research with an open mind and kind of thinking about what might make a suitable edition and kind of bearing in mind that a lot of it is luck, I think, in terms of selecting what you might want to publish. The second sort of question or topic that Richard and I sort of came up with prior to the workshop was different formats for publishing scholarly editions, and Richard's touched on this a little bit. And certainly I entirely endorse what he said. We're very, very keen at the Camden to broaden the types of material that we publish. And I think we are doing that. But I think we also have a very long way to go in doing that a little bit more. So I think sort of normal publishing advice, for example, if you're publishing research articles, can be look at the journal, look at the types of article they publish and see what's suitable. I think I'd emphatically say don't necessarily do that at the moment with Camden, because I think, as Richard said, our history of publishing in this series has tended to be fairly traditional Western political history. And while, of course, that's important, and we don't, as Richard said, we don't want to discourage people for whom that is a specialism. If you come across a source that you think is important that isn't represented, that's actually potentially quite a positive thing. I've got a question on the Padlet, which I think fits quite well within this section, actually. So I'll come to that now, if that's okay with you, Richard. So somebody's asked, is it possible to include images in scholarly editions, such as original photos or drawings included in a text? The answer is yes, it is. Many of our editions do have some kind of imagery. Of course, the extent to which that's necessary will depend on a lot of things. But the quick answer is yes. There is some caveats. Of course, depending on how you want to reproduce them, there may be publishing charges. And different series will have different expectations or different costs to publishing images. So at Camden, internal images in a volume we can reproduce in black and white. If you want to have coloured images, then there's a charge for that the author would have to carry. The cover image, needless to say, really is always in colour. And the other thing to bear in mind is permissions. So generally we say that the cost of acquiring permissions lays with the author, although we can assist in trying to find funding or avenues of sources of funding for that, if that's not something that's viable. But of course, different archives, different repositories will have very different rules about what it will cost you to acquire the permissions necessary to publish it. And of course, from a Camden perspective, Richard and I can help at that stage. If you're at the stage of deciding on images for a volume, then we can help you to work out how to do that, who to approach, and how much that might cost. In terms of options for publishing, so there are many different formats. So partly that depends on the type of source that is produced. So Richard's mentioned a few of these. So letters, diaries, sort of government papers, those kinds of prose materials are really a fairly standard format for us. So the way in which those might be laid out on the page will vary depending on the type of document. But also bear in mind that, I guess less obvious sources like, for example, poetry might also be a viable addition. We've recently published, and unfortunately I don't have the hard copy to show you, but we've recently published a transcription and translation of an early French, essentially a poem. So we have the capacity for publishing, and that volume has facing translation. So it has the original French, and then on the facing page has the English translation. So we have the capacity to find ways of publishing slightly less conventional material as well. And the other thing to bear in mind in terms of formats, and Richard touched on this a little bit when he talked about the boundaries and sort of deciding what to include in an edition. And sometimes there will need to be decisions made to bring something into a size that's viable to publish. So some kind of editorial decision will have to be made about what to include and about what to leave out. But we also wanted to flag that I think the series is probably best known for publishing full length volumes. And in terms of Camden, our kind of limits are that we wouldn't publish a single volume that's less than about 60,000 words in entirety, and we can't go above 135,000 words in entirety. So that's the kind of boundaries that you're looking at. Different publishers vary, but I would say that is fairly standard. but we also have the capacity to publish shorter editions. So quite often it may be that you have come across maybe a couple of letters, or you've come across a very short diary, or something that holds a lot of scholarly importance, but which doesn't make up a full volume. And we publish volumes that are miscellany volumes that are made up of a number of shorter pieces to create a volume that can be published as a volume. In fact, my first edition was in a miscellany volume. So if you have something that you think is really important, but it's shorter, that's also a viable option, and something that would be really keen to hear about. So length doesn't necessarily make it more important, I suppose is the point. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Richard, or whether you want to go to the Padlet and look at some of these.
Yeah, we'll sort of bash them between us. There's a couple of questions. I think, if you don't mind, the person that asked about permission to publish sources, could we tackle that in the breakout rooms? Because we've had another question. We're bound to get common questions on similar themes. So we are going to tackle that later. So we're not ignoring that. And I'll just ask about, does it only have to be sources in English, Siobhan? So your recent experience of your latest volume is probably a good example on that one.
Yeah, no, it doesn't have to be only in English. I think if it was not in English, we would want it to be translated. But in the example that I've just given, the original French manuscript was transcribed, and then the author did a translation as well. So the original French was kind of intact, if you like. So the original manuscript was kind of preserved, but the translation is there to make it obviously usable to a broader audience. So no, they're not published only in English, but I think we probably would. And I say probably because we do tend to judge these on a very, very much a case-by-case basis, because they're all so different in nature. But I think we would ask for there to be some kind of translation to make that a usable volume to a broad readership.
Yeah. And another question we'll tackle now is, would an inventory be a suitable topic? So what are your thoughts on that?
I think absolutely. Essentially, that there isn't anything that isn't suitable. Really, it very much, our judgment and the judgment of the people that we ask to review proposals is whether this is a source which is going to be, that is important enough that people will want to use it. I guess that's kind of our rule of thumb. It doesn't really matter what the source is. And I think it's worth also mentioning that, you know, what's interesting to some scholars might not be interesting to other scholars. So while the inventory or an account book might not seem of interest to everybody, actually they still hold a great deal of historical value. So yeah, absolutely, an inventory would be a suitable source. It just very much depends on what the inventory is and what makes it important. Yeah.
I think the only other thing I'd add is, if it's a solitary source and it's fairly tight for size, it might not even, I don't want to say justify, but it may not even be enough for a miscellany. So it may be you're looking at the sort of, I'd call it the old-fashioned sort of note and comment type article. And again, I think it would just be worth reminding attendees that the transactions, editors of transactions, we do work closely as fellow editorial teams. So it may be that it's suitable to talk about a single source in the context of, if you like, the length of a research article, either with a transcription of the source or just a very full commentary on it. So again, it could be a research article rather than necessarily an edition. I think that's the case, isn't it, Siobhan?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the key thing to say really is that if you have an idea for something and you're not sure where it fits, then please do ask. You know, we enjoy doing this, is why we do it. So you know, please do ask if you're not sure. And as Richard said, you know, if it might be something that we think, you know, the RHS would like to publish, but the format of it might fit better into transactions rather than Camden, then that's something that we can absolutely discuss, and we can put you in touch with the right people. So do just ask the question.
Okay, just to say, we've got a couple more questions, so I'm not ignoring you. I think we'll talk about, there's a question about comparative editions and the opportunities of digital scholarly editing, which again, I think we might come back to in the breakout rooms if people are okay with that. And the kind of editorial support which we offer to editors. Again, I'm only saying that because I know that Jayne and Daniel are going to be talking about their experience. So if the questioners don't mind holding off on those, you will get answers, but do keep them coming, because there's a good range of material there. So are you okay if I move on, Siobhan, now then? Brilliant. So at this point, I'm hoping that our technical support are going to be able to share the screen and show the Camden proposal form, because what I wanted to go through next was things to bear in mind when you approach a publisher and what to consider when writing a proposal. Thanks so much for that. So what we thought would be most useful, and we're not just making a pitch for you to go to Camden, although necessarily we'd be really interested if you did start with us. There are lots of good record societies out there, but just to give you an idea of what we would be looking for, and don't worry, at the end we'll be putting the links into the website where you can find the proposal form and the further information. I've been doing a sort of mini trawl of a few record series sites this morning, and many ask for something quite similar. They may differ in tone or length, but most of the common categories are there. So even if you're not considering Camden for whatever reason, you'll find similar questions being asked. So this is the latest version of our series proposal form. This is the thing that first lands with us as editors. So there's a generic email address, which is there at the top. That would come to us both, and then the process of peer review and consideration would begin. So necessarily, we would like a title for the project, you know, as informative as possible, but you can be lively and interesting in considering titles. We will work with you on titles as well, so it's not sort of written in stone forever, but something fairly expressive of what the edition is about. We're addressing you as potential solitary, but also, of course, collective editors. So we have published editions where a number of editors have been responsible for it. So again, that's something that might be attractive to you, bringing together different skill sets on a particular volume. So we need your names, please. Correspondence address, I guess, for certainly the lead editor or the editor through whom the inquiries are going to be made, although in practice we'd keep in touch with all the editors. Email address. We ask initially just for a brief description of the text, the edition, basically, so fairly tight, sort of not necessarily for branding purposes, but just so we can get an idea fairly quickly of what you're proposing. All right, we know about our periods, but obviously there's a whole vast variety of types of material within them, so it really helps if you can encapsulate quite quickly. Some series call it the elevator pitch. You know, can you make that justification really quite quickly in a compelling way? Obviously, where is the original or the originals on which the edition is based? So the location is item 2. We do ask you to clear permission, or to be in the process really of clearing permission to undertake the edition. It's usually helpful if you've already cleared it, and we did have a question in the Padlet about going about that, and we'll talk about that in the breakout groups. It is important because obviously what we don't want is to issue a contract and you work very hard on it and then find later down the line, for whatever reason, an edition has been refused by the copyright holder or the owner of the material. So we do need to know that fairly upfront. If it's been previously published, and again, we wouldn't discourage you, don't think, oh, if it's been published in a sort of previous state, we won't think about it. I think the justification is what makes it important now to produce this edition. Was a previous edition impartial? Was it selective? Has it been proven to be inaccurate for whatever reason, or inappropriate or unreliable as an edition? So don't think that we would necessarily preclude you, but necessarily, we're not looking to repeat lots of material that's already, freely available in good scholarly works. So again, if it is previously available in some format, it's the justification, it's the rationale for your edition, what makes it stand out. Are there any special difficulties associated with the text? That's helpful if it's going to involve a lot of images, a lot of interesting special characters, different languages. So you might need, to use different attributions as a result. It might be quite partial. There might be a lot of ellipses in it, those sorts of issues. The length of the text as edited, we'll come back to this, I'm sure, but we now ask for proposals that are no longer than 140,000 words, something in that vicinity. all inclusive. So that would include the introduction, the footnoting, any appendices. It doesn't include the index. So it's basically the text and all its scholarly apparatus. So an index might add, a couple of thousand words to that, depending on the complexity of the material it needs to index. But so there is an upper length which we've had to introduce in recent years. But again, that's quite generous. If you think about a standard sort of academic monograph, it often between 60 and 80,000 words these days. So it's quite a lengthy word count, I think. The length of the proposed introduction we would ask you to state, but again, our advice would be no more than 10% of the whole. So you're looking like quite a good research article length, so 10 to 12,000, perhaps more than a research article these days. Details of any special features. So again, the question asked about illustrations, or if there's tables, or if you want to put a number of appendices in, they're more than justified. That's absolutely fine. And then a sort of pitch for where you think the readership lies, who is going to be interested in it in particular. How would we be pitching it for you in terms of the audiences it's likely to reach, and then a proposed delivery date, and a realistic one, because these things, as I'm sure the experienced amongst us know, take longer than you anticipate. So when you think realistically, you could provide a complete text for us. In addition to that sort of pro forma, what we ask for is a sort of one-page outline, which gives you a bit more chance to enlarge upon what you're wanting to do and why it's important, what its significance is. A summary CV, so perhaps a couple of slides that your principal achievements to date, or principal things to say about you. And we do accept proposals from people at all career stages and who have an affiliation with an institution or are an independent scholar. So again, we are quite broad ranging in our authors and editors. And then most importantly, of course, a sample of the edited text with the annotation. That's to give us a sense of how you're going to go about transcribing it and how you're going to be adding that essential scholarly scaffolding, as I'm calling it, the footnoting, the references, the annotation, so that we can send that out as a sample as part of the peer review process. And it gives us a sense of how you're going about things as well. So there's a little more information there, and a note about the miscellany as another option. But that's the essential starting point. And all I'd say is most of these things would be common to record series proposals, whether Camden or other series. Sometimes you might be asked for a little bit more on some things rather than others, but this is what we found to be most useful. Siobhan, do you want to add anything on that, or move on to the next section?
Yeah, the only thing I'll just briefly add before I move on is Richard mentioned about sending the sample. I find that quite often when something comes in for the earlier sort of pre-1800 periods, which obviously is quite broad, I quite often need to go back to the author and ask for images of the manuscript so that whoever's reviewing it can check. It's not only about checking for accuracy, although of course that's also important, but it's also so that they can really judge the kind of editorial conventions, which I'm going to talk about in a moment, that you're suggesting to use. So if you do have images of your manuscript, if you can send them with a proposal, it just saves us a little bit of time. And I think, in my experiences, that's the case for other series as well with other publishers. In terms of, we often get asked about the length of the sample, how much should I send for a sample? Again, this is a little bit how long's a piece of string. It depends a little bit what the nature of the source is. If it's quite standard, if it let's say it's a series of letters and it's all in the same hand, it uses very similar language throughout, it's all written by the same person, then we probably don't need a massive amount. Something in the region of 3 or 4 A4 sides maybe. Again, and that's not a rule, that's just what we find kind of tends to work. If it's a manuscript that's very, very varied, you might want to give us a couple of pages of one hand, a couple of pages of another, with images to go with them, just so that we can judge. And it's also partly about we're also looking at how we are going to practically present this in a volume on the page, where we have limited widths and we have certain things that we have to adhere to. So part of it is also about that. So I think that's the only thing I had to add to that.
And I'll just come in, there's a question about, you mentioned letters. Do you accept proposals about ballads and songs? And I'd say absolutely. It would be really
Definitely.
good to have a proposal
Yeah.
about something involving ballads and songs.
Yeah. Someone else suggested about library catalogues.
Yeah.
Yes, again, absolutely. Library catalogues would be a great source. Digital publications, that's a really interesting one. We do publish our editions digitally, and they are word searchable. In terms of a searchable database, that's not something that we have so far discussed, although it's something that we could discuss. So if that question really is about a specific source, do get in touch with us, and we can absolutely discuss what we might be able to do, because there are, as Richard said, many options. I'm aware, just keeping half an eye on the time, do please keep the questions sort of coming into the Padlet. Hopefully when we've finished what we want to say, we'll have a few minutes to address any we haven't had a chance to get to. The next thing is how we determine editorial conventions or editorial principles. So any edition that you, certainly modern edition that is published, will have a section somewhere near the beginning usually that will be termed editorial principles or editorial conventions. And what that is doing is it's telling the reader what you as an author or an editor have done to the text. So how are you presenting it? It might be things like, have you, if the text has a lot of contractions, so if it uses a lot of abbreviations, have you silently expanded anything? So for example, it can be common to silently expand place names if there's no doubt about what the place name is, to just render that in full rather than sort of printing the abbreviation that's been used by the author. It might be to do with use of capital letters. Have those been modernised? Has any punctuation been added by you as the editor? And this is always a really kind of interesting and quite contentious topic. And I know that we'll talk about this in the breakout rooms. And this is something that can differ, again, depending on what period your manuscript is from or what the nature of the manuscript is. And different presses have different rules or different expectations for how these will be done. So just as kind of a quick anecdote, so I've currently got 2 editions that are under contract. During they kind of got proposed around the same time to different societies, and one of them loved something that I suggested for the editorial conventions. I suggested the same thing for the other one and they hated it and they want me to do something different. So, and obviously kind of had to have discussions with both sides about how we were going to do something that we were all kind of happy with. So that's just to give an example of, there's no kind of one right way to determine your editorial conventions. It's very, very dependent on the manuscript. I think a good rule of thumb is that minimal interjection is usually good. You don't want to change the nature of the manuscript or risk changing what the original author intended. But sometimes to make it usable, you do need to do something to make it readable and to make it usable. So in terms of how you determine those, I mean, I would say if you're not experienced at doing this, a really good place to start is to look at editions of similar material and read what those authors have done. You can obviously ask whoever your editor, if it's Camden, you can ask Richard or I, depending on who's handling it, for advice. And ask more experienced scholars who've done this kind of thing before for advice as well. But generally, there's always a process of discussion. So what you suggest to the editorial conventions, we may well say, we love 80% of that, but we can't do this, or we don't think you should do this. And we will enter into a dialogue with you about how we determine those. So as I said, I would start by looking at what other scholars have done, but don't take them as rules. There aren't really hard and fast rules for how scholarly editions are put together. Richard, have you got anything you want to say about that?
No, I think that's all great advice. It might segue into my bit about the introduction as well, if that's okay.
Of course, yeah.
I'm just picking up a question in the Padlet. How far in future would you typically expect a proposed delivery date to be? That's a really interesting one. I mean, obviously what we don't want are, I guess, things on the stacks for 10 years from hence, but we would work with you in terms of establishing a realistic date. That's the best thing I think I can say. I think that's fair, isn't it, Siobhan? So obviously some people have got something they think is ready to go and fairly serviceable, and it sort of gets them into the system fairly quickly. That doesn't necessarily guarantee you'll get further up the queue for publication. But obviously, you know, a realistic date, what we don't want to get into is something that's contracted and, you know, we're constantly asking, is it happening? Is it happening? So we're a little bit tighter, certainly within Camden these days, on making sure that the date that is agreed in the contract is realistic, and that both parties understand that and appreciate that. So I guess that might affect your timing on when you want to propose something, but we would encourage you to propose something early so we can talk to you about it, certainly if it's in its initial stages, and then we can work out things like timing subsequent to that, because it maybe you're at the start of the journey, you know, you've just identified it, but there's a massive amount of work to do. So we won't want to discourage you from making a pitch, but we do have to be mindful of our future commitments. At the moment, we publish 2 volumes a year, and we usually try and publish one pre-1800 and one post-1800 for want of better differentiation. Sometimes that varies depending on how many proposals are in the system. But I think that's fair, isn't it, Siobhan?
I think that's very fair, and I think you also, you know, if you've discovered or come across a manuscript that you think might be suitable, but you haven't yet done a lot of work on it, get in touch with us by email and just say, is this the sort of thing you might consider? And we'll either say yes or no. Then you can wait to submit the proposal. The proposal doesn't have to come immediately. And I think, as Richard said, yeah, we're kind of looking for a realistic date. We are, of course, aware that things change, people get new jobs and have new commitments and can't always deliver. And there certainly is some leeway, but it's really helpful for all parties, including the press, to know roughly. And, you know, again, the volume that I've just talked about with the facing page translation, that was quite difficult for the press to kind of come up with a way of practically publishing that. Which is kind of their problem in a sense, but that needed much longer in terms of dealing with the press than we would normally have. So if you have something that you think might be particularly complicated, the earlier we know about it, the better, because we can make sure that it's viable and that CUP can publish it. And as I said, they will usually find a way. But then it might be that you say to us, well, okay, I'll have a proposal with you next year when I've had a chance to work on the manuscript and make sure that it is as good as I think it is. Yeah.
Excellent. I know we only got a few minutes before we go into breakout rooms, and again, this is something which I'm sure we'll pick up in the discussion, and it'll be good to hear what Daniel and Jayne say about their experiences of how to write an introduction. But just as a sort of overview, if you like, the introduction for an edition, as we've just indicated, is now about 10% of the whole. So if you're looking at 140,000 all in, you know, between 10 to 12,000, I guess, is ideal. A little bit more is sort of within the parameters. And I guess there are certain things you need to do in addition to obviously setting out your editorial conventions. What you probably want to do is actually discuss the subject matter or the topic of the edition, and how it is expanding our range of knowledge or understanding of that area. So new perspectives, new ideas. So it is a contribution to the historiography of the area that it relates to. So you probably want to be, you know, analysing it. That's your academic expertise coming to bear. But also, I think if there is information about the history of the manuscript or the manuscripts in your edition, I think that's also useful. I think people would expect that. So what is the history? Why did it end up in the particular place it did? Did it have any prehistory? Have other historians worked over it? Have there been attempts or not to publish it before? Have they been successful? If it's a text where you can talk about issues like its format, the nature of the language or the genre, how it was circulated, what sort of reception or consequences it had if it was published material, or of course, conversely, was it only intended for private use or private reflection? That might be the case with certain diaries or correspondence. So I think there are important issues about the source or sources in the edition, but also about how they've been used and interpreted historically, down to the point at which you are publishing them in an edition of your own. And again, just to reinforce what Siobhan said, that's why the editorial conventions are important, because it's your, if you like, it's like, you know, when you're taught at school maths, you know, show me your methods, show me your workings out. It's your workings out. What have you done? What have you added to the text, if anything, and how would you justify that? What's your rationale for the interventions that you've made? Sometimes you need to make it legible and readable and usable, but it's important for other people to come along and have faith in it and see it's credible and understand what you've done or not done and why. And it might be, as Siobhan's experience suggests, because the experience of certain presses or series is different from others, but having that rationale laid out for the reader in the introduction, I think, is really important. So I think that's all I want to say in the introduction. Anything you want to add, Siobhan?
I think just not to what you said about the introduction, which again, of course, will vary depending on the nature of the source and what you need as an author or editor to explain about the context. I think the only other thing, and we're aware that in a moment we're going to move into these breakout rooms, but just a couple of things that we kind of had flagged, and then there's a couple more questions that we'll perhaps very briefly address before we move on, are obviously things like ref and open access are of course really important, and I know that everyone in the room will be very aware of these kind of issues. So just kind of very briefly, these kind of editions are highly refable. In fact, there was a comment after, I think it was after Ref 2014, the kind of post-ref report, there was a comment on the fact that departments hadn't submitted these or hadn't double weighted them, and the kind of shock about why this hadn't happened, because they're so important and represent such a big amount of work. That's not to say that every single edition will be worthy of double weighting or will be 4-star, but they absolutely can be. So that's one thing to kind of bear in mind. In terms of open access, and Richard, I think you did a bit of kind of last minute research into this, because of course the landscape is currently changing dramatically. But at the moment, these kind of editions are not in the scope of open access. So while we do publish them online, that's not something that you currently would need to worry about. I think partly because Richard and I are not experts in this, but also partly because it's not really what we're here to talk about. We don't really want to get embroiled in a discussion about that, but we wanted to flag it just so it's something that you can bear in mind when you're considering, if you're considering proposing an edition of this nature.
I think my understanding is the introductions are published as open access by the Royal Historical, but the edition itself wouldn't necessarily. Right, the 2 breakout rooms are going to be ready shortly. I think there's just a couple more questions about digital to print and how far in the future do you have volumes scheduled to publish? Do we want to tackle these now or in the breakout room, Siobhan?
I mean, in terms of how far in the future a volume scheduled to publish, I mean, it's obviously, again, it's hard to be exact because it depends where we are. But for example, at the moment, we're completed manuscripts that have gone through the whole process and are kind of nearing the finish line. Ones that haven't yet been submitted, we're looking at 2025. So the 2 volumes for 2023 are either published or in press. The 2 for 2024, we know what those are when we've received them. So at the moment, and actually that's not bad. So one of the editions that I've just had accepted or was accepted last year won't be published before 2026. And that's because of the publisher delay in their timescales. It does vary, but you can move up and down the queue depending on how quickly you can get as the final publishable manuscripts.
I think I get the sense we're being prompted to go into the
we'll come back to that digital to print question. I'll make a note of that.
So I think we'll break there. There'll be a short roundup at the end, but we'll go into our breakout rooms and hopefully we'll pick up any questions that we've not been able to so far. So see you in our breakout rooms. Thank you.
Welcome back, Richard, Siobhan, Jayne and Daniel. Over to you.
Well, thanks very much, everyone. I hope that you found those breakout sessions useful. I don't know how Richard's was. We ran out of time a little bit to deal with everything. As Richard and I said earlier, please do feel free to email us with any queries, questions that we didn't get to. We'd be very, very happy to discuss those. And any ideas that you have, even if it's just a kernel of an idea and you're not sure how to proceed, please do get in touch with us, and we'd be very, very happy to talk those through with you. I'd like to also just say thank you to Daniel and Jayne for giving up their time to be here today and to talk through their experiences. I hope it was useful for you to hear from people who have gone through that process with us. Richard, I'm not sure if there's anything else we particularly want to raise before we close.
Just to say, I'm sure you did it in your breakout room, but I just finished in mine by addressing the question about the support you get, and just to reinforce that you'll get practical support from us as editors throughout the process, from the initial proposal all the way through to publication. So, you know, potential editors, be they very experienced or first timers, hopefully will find that we do form part of the service that we offer in terms of the publication of your volumes. And Jayne kindly reinforced that that was the case, her experience, even though it was with our predecessors. But I think we're hoping to keep that tradition going. So yeah, you will be supported as potential editors with us throughout.
And I mean, just to also say, I mean, Richard and I do this because we love scholarly editions. So almost the more complicated, the better. If there are problems and things that we can solve, that in a lot of ways, that makes what we do more enjoyable. So no matter how tricky you think it might be, and equally, even if you think the question is obvious, it won't be obvious to you if you've never done this before. So if this is your first time thinking about this, please do get in touch with any question that you have.
Thank you. That's great. Thanks everyone for coming today. I think
Right.
back to Philip.
Thank you very much, Richard and Siobhan and Jayne and Daniel, for a really fascinating and incredibly rich discussion about the many directions in which scholarly editing and publishing can go. And I hope you've all learned something from it and have been able to share your experience. So just before we finish, it's my great privilege to thank formally all of you for attending, for those of you who submitted questions in advance and for asking them in the breakout sessions, and especially again to Siobhan, Richard, Jayne and Daniel for their time and insights, which were very valuable indeed. And then finally, just to remind anyone who might be new to the Society, the Royal Historical Society is a learned society with a membership for all members, all stages of people's academic and historical careers. And it includes people, many people who are not part of higher education, just people who love and work in history. So please do consider joining us. And also that we have many events running throughout the year, and we will be returning in September with the first of our lectures on the 15th of September. And that'll be followed by a series of other lectures, training events, workshops, and panel discussions through to the end of 2023. And all the details of those are available on the RHS website. And again, we'll send you details of those. So with that, thank you all very much for attending. I wish you all the best with your scholarly editing, and a very good afternoon. Goodbye.